Steiner, that Rudolf Steiner and Spengler were very much of the same era and were in fact rivals. And Steiner, if you actually read his stuff, which isn't so filled with the occult, is actually quite interesting as a philosopher. And I noticed that they're making a lot of similar points to what Kenneth is making here. There's a sort of similarity. They were the tail end of the German idealists in a sense. So Kenneth could be sort of very much of that persuasion, that sort of continental philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I'll have to ask him what he thinks of Spengler. I don't know. I haven't talked to him about Spengler.
I
Uh,
was starting to make that point. They talk
I know.
about the age of the Greeks, which the Spengler calls the Apollonian era.
Yes.
And this is a thing. 4 years before Spengler published his book, Steiner was referring to our current epoch and having Faust as the mascot of it, more or less, as the figure which explains it. And this is, of course, what Spengler does, calling our current culture the Faustian.
Hmm.
And I just wonder what the link is there. Did they read similar materials that inspired that thought? Or
Oh, for sure. Yes. Yeah,
now,
but go ahead.
Steiner makes a point that, of course, if you go back to the Greco-Romans, nature was an ever-present fact. And in a sense, he stresses that we're suffering from a certain sort of danger, the modern man, of ignoring nature.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, this is what Kenneth would argue would be the Greek perspective on us as well, that the modern world is the world of arbitrary human will, in which we believe we can make things the way we want them, pretty much without any interference from God or nature.
Which sounds very Faustian.
It does, right? That's Faust's bargain, right? That he can remain detached. He can consume all the good things of the cosmos under the bargain with Mephistopheles without ever being attached to it and unable to dissociate his will from it. And of course, that doesn't it turns out not to
Now,
be a thing people can do.
now, I was reading Steiner, and on this he said that these epochs suffer from their different dangers. And he said the Greco-Roman epoch, we have Oedipus, and his great danger is the riddle. He gets confused
Hmm.
what's going on
Hmm.
and being misled. But Steiner said the modern epoch, our great danger is Mephistopheles. And yeah, he's talking about the Pied Piper. We are being sucked in. He's all over the place now. Propaganda, advertising.
Yeah.
There is this force all over the place that's trying to suck us in. The Nazis, they were this was the Pied Piper. You keep on going on about, well, the Germans were so rational and so wonderful and such a heights of human culture, and they end up following somebody like Adolf, which really I think Spengler met Adolf, but he was a little bit, he was a little bit, yeah, this might be a useful movement. And then he had another look and another look. Don't look at the man behind the curtain. He thought, well, these guys are really thugs. They're not
Yeah.
civilized. And this is the thing he warns, this seems to be the thing Steiner's warning, that watch out for the Pied Piper. Don't just take things as they are. Keep on looking, keep on asking questions, because the Pied Piper doesn't want you asking any questions.
I mean, this certainly ties in strongly to the text and where we're at right now, because this is what we're talking about. Is when this is paragraph 10. I've loaded here from the book, and we went through the first half of this last week. Um, we'll do a quick review of it to ramp us up into the second half. But this idea that um, we have this problem with a lack of self-providence that makes it so that our desires often lead us to self-destruction instead of to self-providence. And this is an accident of evolution. This is kind of how nature has made us, but that it's something that we have to struggle to learn to overcome. The Greeks at the beginning of the period that they begin writing down are more worried about that half of the problem. They're less worried about the other half of the problem, which is you detach yourself from your desires, but you end up attaching yourself to ideologies. And now it's your logics and your schemas and your systems of rationality that have trapped you just as effectively as your appetites used to. While you're busy congratulating yourself for having disconnected yourself from your appetites, you're every bit as much a slave, but now you're a slave of the other faculty of the mind in its naive, kind of unleashed form, which is noesis. So all of this is tied up in what you're talking about. Heraclitus warns us about desire. He warns us about, being a slave to what you want. But he does the opposite as well. He warns us against having a private intelligence of our own. Says we should attach ourselves to the shared intelligence of nature, the way that the cosmos actually operates and not the way that we think it operates, which is where we get into trouble. All of this ties into that. So I'm gonna just drop this little bit of Heraclitus in here that's relevant. It's the first half of the temperance and wisdom one that we did 2 weeks ago. So here it is in transliteration and in the original text.
Yeah, Steiner's warning was virtual possession. Mephistopheles is a case of possession. And
Yeah,
that's clear if you read Faust. Faust is possessed.
yes.
Gretchen's trying to warn him, who's this guy you're hanging around with? And it just doesn't work with why am I worried about this guy, Mephistopheles? What's wrong with him? I don't see a problem.
Well, and that's what's interesting about it is that, at the time he's writing, we're inclined to take the medieval interpretation, which is some external force has possessed us. But, I mean, Goethe knew his stuff. He could just as well have been saying, Mephistopheles isn't some external demon that's possessing Faust. That's his own character. That's his daimon. It is in his nature, to want to flirt with his desires and imagine that his will is somehow immune to it. So this we come back again to the difficulty of expressing this idea sophronein arete megiste. So arete we can get this idea of, and the word virtue is pretty iffy here. Really the word ought to be arete. We don't have an English equivalent. What is the thing that um, is the greatest for us in the way that the speed is the greatest for the cheetah and the diving of the peregrine falcon and so forth. What is our thing that allows us to, when it is fulfilled in the adult form, allows us to pursue our self-providence? What is that gift that we have that will help to guide us in that direction? And Heraclitus is saying the greatest of all of the things, the faculties that we have available to us is sophronein. And just like arete doesn't translate, sophronein doesn't translate. We're stuck with this issue of it doesn't really mean to be temperate. That's just fumbling around in the dark, throwing words at the wall, hoping something sticks. This is that self-providence. Sophronein is that faculty that animals have that draws them naturally and inexorably in the direction of the things that are healthy for them and that human beings lack. And in its absence, we are drawn towards any old thing. We could be drawn towards collecting Magic the Gathering cards or Hot Wheels, or drawn towards. I mean, any mania can possess us, whether it's appetitive or ideological, because our sophrosune is missing. It's weak unless we develop it. Unless we take this kind of faculty of the mind that's sort of born atrophied in Homo sapiens, and exercise and exercise and exercise it to develop it into something strong, we're going to have this congenital problem that we inherit that animals don't have, that we are going to fail to orient in the way that the sunflower, the heliotrope, orients towards the sun. Animals orient towards their own self-providence, and we don't do that unless we develop that faculty. So this is what's under laying all of paragraph 10 is this concern. And it's that, when we can read the first half of this paragraph now with that in mind, and you see that what he's talking about is specifically the majority of people don't know they have this problem, and they assume that their desires and ideologies are speaking to them in a self-provident voice, that they're naturally being led towards what's good for them, which is not true. We lack that sense that the animals have. And that's where Faust gets into trouble, is he too lacks that sense of self-providence. He could attach to anything. He overvalues the freedom, infinite freedom of his will, the deal that he makes with Mephistopheles. But the problem is we are not equipped to do that. I mean, if Mephistopheles were to try to cut a deal with a cheetah, the cheetah would naturally gravitate towards what's healthy for it. It would use its powers in a healthy direction because it wants healthy things. But we want all kinds of crazy things. So if our power increases, then the defects in our self-providence are magnified until they become catastrophic, either just for us or for the people around us, or in the case of, Oedipus, for the entire polis of Thebes.
Well, that was the case we had with George Gonzalez. He was there on Saturday. A man possessed by his ideology,
Yes,
without ever questioning it.
he's amazing.
Okay, you got an ideology, but you got to have the antithesis as well. Actually, this is what I'm noticing there's a lot of today.
Yes,
Thesis without antithesis.
that's right.
Okay, you got your belief, but you need to think, well, am I right? Could
Right,
be wrong.
right. That self-questioning, right? That's the thing that when he's saying the majority of humans, have no assent to the kind of paideia that defines distinctively human excellence, he's saying what you're saying, in other words, that they lack that ability to string their desires and ideologies against their opposites, to test them, to probe them, to look for their weaknesses, to make sure that you're not a prisoner of them. That's what the adult, mature human mind is supposed to do in Homo sapiens, according to Aristotle and Heraclitus and other Greeks who study us as a naturally occurring species. But we can only do it if we culture ourselves and have been cultured by our, surrounding people to want to do it, to exercise that atrophied muscle and develop that faculty as well as that orientation. Donald, you got your hand up. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
There is a sort of an explanation of arete somewhere in Aristotle that Kenneth once paraphrased. He was trying to teach me something. The edge is the arete, the virtue of the knife. It's that without which it isn't what it is, and that's the kind of thing I can remember. It's a simple image that, what is the edge to the knife?
That's a great way of putting it.
It's the whole point of the knife.
Yes.
Without the edge, it's not a knife.
The point of the cheetah is to run. If it's not running, you're not seeing a healthy cheetah. The point of the heliotrope is to follow the sun. That's the thing that it can do that most of the plants are not as effective at. So yeah, there is when he's talking about the knife being the edge being the arete of the knife, of course it's a metaphor because a knife is not a living thing, and so it doesn't actually have self-providence per se. But it's a reasonable approximation.
I think that would be for the best.
Oh, hi, David. You come off mute. Do you want to add something? He says, oops, I hit it by accident. Okay, I'll just mute you again. Phil, what's on your mind?
I wonder, as human beings, because we're limited by our abilities uh, of intellect. I wonder whether there's not a limit in terms of the amount of choice you have. In other words, maybe that's the success of capital. By flooding you with so many choices, you you can't make a choice. You can't make the sharp decision. You can't cut it with a knife in a sense, if you want to put it that way. Whereas if you were just given like 3 or 4 choices, that might be very comfortable to choose from. But when you have such a surplus, they're always bombarding you with, and in a sense, they don't really care which one you choose as long as you choose something. And then if you don't choose that one, they'll come up with another one. Like you, in order to even stand still, you have to keep running on the treadmill. Your intellect, maybe that's where the dialectic fails, because we have too damn many, like, multi-factor dialectics. I mean, that becomes kind of difficult. You suppose that you go to the fork of the road, and you're going to go A or you're going to go B. Possibly there's maybe C, but it's fairly easy. It's not absolute, but it's fairly easy. But when you have like 305, that then you're kind of messed up. So maybe that's a hint of our human limitations. It's not that we're not virtuous. It's just that in some aspect, I'm not saying the choice is not good. In some aspect, maybe surplus is not a good thing. We think of it. I mean, it just seems like a good thing. Like, oh wow, there's all this stuff and there's all this choices. All like, don't take those choices away from me. But in fact, it's the same. It's the same thing as putting a plug in your choice.
Yeah, that's right.
That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, it's the case with medical software, for example, that we found in the VA that people are able to be more productive if they don't have access to everything the computer can do. You start by narrowing them down to the things they need to be able to do for their job. And with those at the very top level selection, you put the things that they do the most often every day that they're going to need to do all the time, and then the things they need to do less often you bury down in menus. And if you kind of create this structure in which you've got 7 plus or minus 2 choices, and some of the choices lead to other choices to be able to find a thing you're looking for, then people are able to be far more effective than if you just give them everything. You give them everything, it's overwhelming. It's the 7 plus or minus 2 registers in our brain can't keep up. We just flounder. And you can also think about it as stages of development as well. When you're learning something, you have to start with the basics. And only once you've got the understanding of the basics are you going to be able to understand the more complex things anyway. So if someone offers you the choice of the more complex things right off the bat, you can pick them, but you're going to screw them up because you're not ready for those things.
So is it possible that in a sense we're criticizing modern culture against the Greeks because they have fewer choices? So arate is a little easier. Like in our case, like we don't know whether we want to run track or do the high jump or play basketball, or into the swim. Like there's just so many possibilities, like, endless. So, yeah, that I don't want to quite say that, maybe we need to be a little uh meticulous about making a comparison. I mean, we're fallen because not because we don't have enough choice, but maybe because we have too much, like, and some cases you're fallen because you don't have any choice. You just got to do what the dictator says, and that's it, right? So there's some happy medium in between, in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I was struck by I went to the Netherlands with a friend. Oh, must be 25 years ago now. And I was struck by all the, I think I've mentioned this before, all the laws they don't have. Like there's no law that says you can't be naked in the park. Most people aren't naked in the park because they don't want to be naked in the park. It's, you know, it's Europe and that's out of doors, and most of the year that's not going to be comfortable. And even if it were, you know, it's embarrassing and disruptive and so forth. Most people don't want that. So they just don't make a law like that. You know, and if you're naked in the park, you know, two police cars don't pull up packed with police officers who come in to treat you like some kind of dangerous threat. So there is a way in which, you know, if you are in a state of chaos, more choice is bad. But if you're in a state of cosmos, more choice is good. So you know when would be the time that it would be appropriate to be naked in the park. You know, when you're younger, you don't know. You don't understand what you're dealing with. You don't know what the factors are. And this is kind of a kind of a metaphor for choice in general. We have to be able to grow into freedom to have options. That fits with ethos anthropoi daimon, you know, this concept of our character, that we have to cultivate it in order to open up, you know, possibilities for behavior that we didn't have before. And especially what they want us to do is open up possibilities for behavior based on self-providence, that you gradually practice the habits and learn what are the things that are good for you, regardless of whether or not you're drawn to them, so that you can learn to teach yourself to be drawn to them, because you don't start out that way. I mean, you start out being drawn to a few things, which is good, but they're fairly rudimentary. And you know, mama's not going to let you suckle at the breast your entire life, so you're going to have to grow out of that initial, you know, set of desires in order to become a person. So this is the problem, you know, that you know, the Greek perspective is that this is this critical concern that we have, paideia, that we've got to be cultivated to develop the habits and desires and orientation towards self-providence, because we aren't born with it. That's that, you know, we gave it up in order to be smarter and more creative. So congratulations, we're basically insane. That line between, you know, genius and madness being a thin line, that would be the summation the Greeks have of our entire species. But there is no line. The genius and the madness come at the same time. We got to be so smart because we lack the common sense that animals have to know you should run away from the fire. So we run towards the fire and we pick up a branch, and next thing you know, we're wielding fire, you know, which is a crazy thing to do, but, you know, powerful and creative and interesting. So, but the flip side is, you know, well, then how are we going to develop the common sense not to light ourselves on fire? And the answer is, well, it ain't going to be done by instincts, because we got rid of those to make ourselves able to go get the fire in the first place. So it's going to have to be through cultivation and self-cultivation of our character. That's the structure of the psyche from the Greek perspective. So, and the thing that's interesting is that the Greeks have this orientation about how important this is. They're structuring their society focusing on this problem of how do you try to raise everybody to develop self-providence and an appetite for self-providence. And yet, even at their height, they figure no more than a third of their population ever successfully develop the habit of self-providence. And they're probably overestimating, right? Because of the way they do it by class instead of by any kind of clear measurement of who's really an Aristos versus, you know, who's been assigned that class. So the number's probably smaller, but, you know, even if it weren't smaller, that they, with all the things that they tried to do, they only managed to get, you know, about a third of people, maybe at the most, to be able to focus on what's healthy. You know, the vast majority of people are still just lost in appetites and ideologies. So this is, you know, this is what he amplifies in the next sentence. And I'm just going to drop these into the chat one by one so that we can isolate them. This idea that effectively, if you're still immersed in naive gnosis, in the experience of life, in which your feelings loom so large to you and your sensations loom so large to you, then you're a slave, right? You're a slave to what you're experiencing at all times. But conversely, if you go through the massive struggle to extricate yourself from that intense matrix of immersion, and you develop kind of an intellectual distance and a capacity for disciplined reasoning, then now you're a slave to something else. You think that you've liberated yourself, and your obsession now becomes, oh, those unhealthy, irrational, emotional people. I don't want to be like them. I want to be, intellectual and logical. But of course, now you're a slave to something new, which is your other faculty, noesis, that you've, in a naive form, that you've clung to in order to extricate yourself from your naive gnosis. And so now you're just as likely to do crazy things, but they're, instead of being parochially crazy, understandably infatuated with things that you shouldn't be infatuated with, now it's going to be sort of an insane kind of crazy where you're attached to things that don't even exist. They're systems, like being attached to money, or being attached to social status, in a junior high school. Who's the clickiest of the cliques? Well, this isn't even a thing. This is some kind of crazy, artificial ladder that's been constructed by people for being able to feel better about themselves because they can point to other people who are worse than they are. But these kinds of manias are both the natural, inevitable, most common forms of slavery from the ancient perspective, that you enslave yourself. You don't need somebody to come along and coerce you. You're already a slave, either to the one or to the other. And he alludes here a bit he says either they're self-centered appetites, and there he's focusing on naive gnosis and the experiential life, or they're extrovertive materialism. And that is partly a reference to the experiential, taking things as they appear, form of life, but partially that's a reference to people who are so focused on externals like social climbing and status, and did I win a medal, and who has the most money. That is Banausic concerns, right, that are external to you. And the reason that the extrovertive external side is being used in this sort of contemptuous way by the Greeks is because they recognize the challenge is you got to get in there and start cultivating your own character to overcome your slavish attachments to the one or the other. And that requires an introvertive focus, that you've got to be willing to look inside and see which of your problems are coming from you and not from, somebody didn't respect me enough, or I didn't get that banana. So, he says, binds them to a low estate, a subpolitical and subcultural existence as slaves or economic animals, merely human beings who are merely under an illusion that they are not slaves. That is to say, they are free in the sense that no external compulsion is required to make them slaves, because they're already in thrall to either their experiential life or their ideological life, on one or the other, on the other hand. So it's, we talked about subpolitical last week. We talked about this idea that they see politics and philosophy as being inextricably linked, and that if politics are not grounded in philosophical concerns, then they're not actually politics, no matter what you call them. So everything we have in America, none of it's politics, not a single bit of it, because we don't have a polis, and we don't have any Aristoi. We don't have anyone who cares about doing the right thing for everybody. Everybody's concerned with what can they do within the system? How can they make the system work for them? It's all Banausic. None of it is Aristic. But what we didn't talk about last week is this concept of subcultural. That if you have something you call a culture, but it does not help people to develop an appetite for an awareness of and a focus on self-providence, then it is in fact not a culture. You can call it one, you can define it as one. 8 billion people can all have a vote and say, well, we say it is a culture, and they're all still wrong. This is the Greek argument, right? Kata phusei, according to nature, is the overriding concern when it comes to defining what things are, and therefore, by consequence, what words mean. You have to have the words to be able to talk about the most important parts of nature and the existential condition that human beings find themselves in as error-prone mortals within this infinite context of nature that's binding upon us. So just like the ancient perspective is judgmental, judgy, value-laden and judgy about assessing the modern world, in its politics, it's equally judgy about assessing the modern world and what passes for a culture among us, which, as modernity gets further and further along, sheds more and more of what would authentically be considered to be vestiges of a culture in its kind of mad dash to replace everything with a marketplace, until eventually there is no religion, there is no politics, there is no art, there's nothing except market. The market is all there is. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, just yesterday, I finally watched the movie Oppenheimer on my computer, and it was a very deep movie, actually, psychologically. And I want to say that maybe what you're saying, in a sense, is something about the limit of knowledge, and that maybe we're made, for whatever reason, that want to pursue knowledge, to know, to truly know, and not just have pretty damn good opinions, you know? And I remember at one point there was a debate, I guess, between theory and practice, because Oppenheimer, knowing quantum mechanics as best he could, probably the best person in America. The German knew it better, like Niels Bohr and so forth, and Heisenberg. But he was charged to in a sense make the atomic bomb, and he went to the technical person who was going to be practical and working out the theories. And there was a confrontation with the guy that, in a sense, about, in some sense, who is more important in some way. They didn't quite put it that way. It turned out to be that way. And the technical guy, the engineer, says, like, your theory doesn't go far enough because you don't know. Because what happens is people are kind of ignorant because you only see the stone, and only when you turn over the stone do you see the snake. It's too damn late at that point. Okay. That was very, very interesting, right? If you don't turn over the stone, you can have all sorts of theories about, but then when you turn it over, suddenly you find out there's a snake there.
Yes.
And that metaphor got to a point where, in a sense, right before they make the bomb, like, there was also the hint that somebody came up with that there was a chance that chain reaction would ignite the atmosphere. Okay. And they didn't quite know what to do with it. The general, whatever his name, I forgot what his name was. And everybody else was like, they wonder whether they should stop. And it got to a point where it became very clear that Enrico Fermi had hinted at that. And so they went to this, I guess, the best mathematician about that. And he worked it out. He says, probably not. He said, well, how much is the probably not? He says, well, close to zero. And he told the general and everybody else, close to zero. And the general that was in charge of the thing says, I wish you could tell me it was zero. He says, as far as we could go with the theory, that's as far as we could go. And they wonder, and they finally decided, they got to take a chance, right? Well, And here, they're not only thinking of themselves, they're thinking about the whole world, right? There's actually a slim possibility that it will ignite the atmosphere and civilization and the earth will be all over. And so they finally blew there was a whole bunch of excitement. They finally mounted a bomb and they blew it up. And at the end, the flash came and all that, and they figure out how far they had to be away to, in a sense, not be affected directly by the blast. And at the end, people it worked. People started applauding, and I questioned in my mind, what were they applauding? Were they applauding for the success of the bomb, or they applauding for the fact that it didn't kill them? You know, because I would be applauding it didn't kill me. It won't kill everybody, you know. In some sense, it's just a powerful bomb. So that was interesting. Like, and of course, he got so mixed up in politics that later on tried to lay it on him. And you know, and I think it got to the point like he had a conversation with Einstein actually prior to being appointed by the government. And I guess the head of the bureau that sort of appointed him, nominated him, you remember he went out and Einstein happened to be there, you know, in the resident. And I guess he was supposed to go and try to get Einstein to be involved in this. And the guy who was head of this saw that there was a brief conversation with Einstein, and then Einstein walked away. Okay. And the guy who was in charge of appointing him, wondered whether he had offended Einstein in some way to push him aside. But that wasn't the case. It turned out that later on, when it was all over, he was involved with it, with all the political stuff that was against him. You know, that he was betraying because after the war, you know, he was very much against creating certainly the hydrogen bomb and so forth. And so he had a conversation with Einstein again, and I guess he asked. I guess he showed the calculation. It might have been Enrico Fermi's calculation, and Einstein, I think, might have walked away because of that. He said, "Well, that's a choice you have to make." And what happened was, in some sense, and now you know, Einstein also know that at this point he was being sort of kangarooed by the court, by the U.S. government for being the anti-bomb guy. And so Einstein says, now you have to face the consequences of what you did. He said eventually they'll understand. It'll takes quite a while for them to forget. So that was very, very interesting because Einstein told him, like, you know, when he was in Germany, he saw what was going on there. He could have stayed in Germany. He loved Germany, but he left. I guess because I guess he saw the snake. So that's interesting. It's like, should we always turn over the stone? Because we want to know. At what point should we not turn over the stone? Because there might be a snake. It might be too late. So there's almost an anti-intellectualism in there, and maybe intellectualism, when it's taken to its extreme, it is the down failure of our culture, of our being, because we desire so much to know, but maybe this is the way of finally understanding there's a limit to knowing, and you should understand your limit, and maybe it's time to not turn over the the stone, the rock, because sometimes at one point it is going to take you down. That's it. I thought that was a very, very interesting discussion because he was very confused about what to do. And of course, they blame him that, you blew the bomb, even though we knew at that point there was no more Germany because they made the bomb for Germany. And also, you dropped the bomb after it was inevitable that Japan would surrender.
Right.
At some point, okay.
Right.
That was a very, very interesting discussion. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. There's a yeah, The Magician's Apprentice is all over this. The Legend of Atlantis is all over this. There's all kinds of we have all kinds of stories and parables that warn us about going too far. But the fundamental problem about our kind of shaky grasp on reality, there's a Kenneth Smith quote, and I feel like he's quoting somebody. He's repeated it multiple times in different books. So I know it's coming from somewhere, but my Google foo has not been strong enough to pin down where it comes from. If any of you can identify the source, that would be great. It'll go into the footnotes of the book. But there's a bit where he says, a man saw a snake he thought was a stick. He reached for the stick and picked up a snake. And that's the saying. And I just, for years I was like, where did that come from? And now I've just sort of given up on pinning it down. But clearly he's summarizing what you're talking about. The move the stone and find a snake, kind of in its more extreme form, as I'm looking right at the snake and I still don't see it. I see something else. And that confusion is thus the source of the tragedy to follow, right? So okay, what else is in this sentence? I mean, human means in parentheses right there. He talks about a subpolitical and subcultural existence as slaves or economic animals, parentheses, human means. And human means is it's a critique of slavery as an economic system in a nutshell, but it's also a critique of a lot more economic systems than that. Anything in which people are reduced to a means and not treated as an end unto themselves. The hidden in this is the wrestling match in ancient Greece with the Banausei, who they didn't entirely understand. They didn't fully appreciate the extent to which Banausei were going to rise to power and bring down Greece. But they certainly knew they were in trouble. And I've mentioned that Aristotle talks about how the marketplace had to have the statues of the charities, graces, right there within sight, to remind people that even when they're in the thick of negotiations trying to get one over on the people that they're trading with, they should always remember that trade shouldn't even exist unless it's for the purpose of friendship. It's to take care of each other. It's to make a better world. It's not just to beat the other guy no matter what. And that has to be there because it's so easy to slip into that noetic mindset and think nothing is real except the game, and I have to win the game. Winning is everything. This is the mindset that when we slip into that mindset, the other person stops being a human being and starts becoming a human means. They're now just a human resource, which is, of course, what we call all our personnel departments now, human resources, right? It's an Orwellian Kafkaesque name, if we could just fully turn and face and deal with it, which is that we are saying we have some economic activities we would like to take place. We haven't been clever enough to build a machine to do it, so we would like to, rent a slave, capture some people, through their debts. And their need to not be homeless and so forth, and compel them that way indirectly to be a tool for us. The argument here is, so he's saying basically several pages worth of things in this one sentence, because he's sort of synthesizing this idea that the Greeks had, that what are you supposed to do with people who enslave themselves via their own character to either their appetites and experiences on the one hand or to their ideologies and systems on the other. What do you do with people like that? Because we have to take care of them, but how do you do it when they lack self-providence? When given a choice, they will choose for society to do things that are destructive to them personally and to society as a whole, because they can't get out of the twin traps of those faculties, because they never fully developed the mature adult human mind. They're basically some flavor of a child. What do you do with them? What's supposed to happen? Now, as we're talking about this, the specter of slavery in the American South and its rationalizations is all over this discussion. I mean, we heard this from Southern slave owners right throughout the 17th and 18th and 19th centuries. They were relentless in saying, oh, these poor people, they just don't know how to take care of themselves, and we're really doing this for their good. That's why we're enslaving them, is they would be living in the bushes like animals, but we're civilizing them and bringing them Christianity and teaching them how to not eat each other. And this was what the slave owners were relentlessly saying. So we have heard these arguments before, but never in a honest, candid, position of genuine concern. It has always been from a position of rationalizing doing what one wants to do to gain power over other human beings. And the fact that we're talking about the ancients means that the discussion is contaminated there too. They may not have had industrial chattel slavery in Athens. They may have had a different form of slavery, but it was still slavery, and it was a descent, it had descended from the Yamnaya invasion and conquest. So it was about to find the indigenous people, conquer them militarily, and then force them to form a caste within your society that labors so that you can keep your time free to do the things that you would rather do. In other words, reducing human beings to human means was the original goal of the ancestors of the Greeks. That was what they set out to do. But then what we're finding by the time we get to Aristotle is people who've gone beyond rationalization, because they've successfully rationalized it for over 1,000 years, but they've moved on to, they now are questioning whether it's working. Athens is falling apart. Greece is falling apart when Aristotle is writing. This isn't working anymore. And they're trying to figure out where they went wrong. And so now they're able to ask questions about the relationship between character and slavery, and whether somebody, has any meaningful freedom in a different way than they were able to do when Greece was at its prime. Just like now, as moderns, we're able to question the foundations of modernity in a way that would have been impossible 100 or 200 years ago, when we were fully in the thick of it and completely believed in progress. And by we, I'm not saying, straight white cis European men, preferably upper class with a lot of money. They believed in their freedom and so forth for themselves and each other. There is that issue of when can you ask these questions and when can't you ask them, and what extra burden, freight of meaning are you carrying along in the discussion. But if we set that aside and look at the question that Aristotle wants us to look at here, it is a significant concern. I mean, it's not just that you've got people who are immature and therefore helpless like a child. Some of them have developed into con artists and predators. Some of them, what they really want in life is to take everything other people have. And if they're allowed to, that's what they'll do. Or they want to enslave other people. And that's what they desperately want to do. They don't think they can win unless they can see somebody else lose. They need to make it happen. They'll take a situation of abundance, or even a situation of potential abundance, and reduce it to a zero-sum game in order to justify the feeling that they've won. So what do you do with people like that? How can you make a civilization if, a third of your population wants to eat another third of your population, or, enslave them, or rip them off, or rape them, or some other kind of exploitation? What do you do? These are the questions that are being asked in this paragraph. Donald, come off mute. Oh, you are off mute. Tell us what's on your mind.
Oh, I was going to say about the industrial reference you made in Athens. The silver mines that supported something like that had, I think, several tens of thousands of slaves. That was, the rationales might seem quite different when you're dealing with household slavery, but I think it's pretty stark when you get to that Athenian money, the silver coin, the owl in the head of Athena on it, you know, the whole basis of their economy there was depended on those mines being worked, and they were worked by tens of thousands of slaves. Different.
Thank you, Donald. Yeah. Yeah, that's brought up in Thucydides' Peloponnesian War, too. There's a battle fought over those mines, as I recall. I need to reread that. I last read it in 1985. I really enjoyed it, but it's been too long. I need to go back to it and remind myself. But yeah, I remember it's not the main peninsula. It's further up Greece. There's a triple peninsula that sticks out into the sea, and that's where the silver mines were that they fought with Sparta over. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, you know, this is partly not my idea, but partly it is my idea. The part that inspired me was I had a discussion in another meetup thing about, and I raised the issue of like coming to understand oneself and to understand the I and myself as developing the mirror image. You see yourself reflected in the mirror, you say, oh, that's me. And you begin to understand that you have a being and that you have an understanding, therefore, with the mirror image, that other beings, human beings like you, have the mirror image, and we could begin to recognize each other as human beings. And this guy said, you kind of got part of that right, not all of it right. He says, the mirror image is about your gaze into the mirror and recognize yourself. He says, what happened when you see another person is that they have a mirror image too, but their gaze is different from your gaze. You either have to accept them as the other that has the mirror image, but there is some difference. Yes, that's true. If you can't accept the otherness of the other, then you're essentially seeing yourself in the other, which is a kind of potential domination. And I began to explore that idea, and I thought to myself, oh, yes, this really reminds me of the fact that human beings are vulnerable. They're only shielded by their skin, which is a very thin layer, right? So we always exist as a vulnerability, and that society, we must understand that we are all human beings, that we are all vulnerable. And if you don't understand the vulnerability of others and accept them that you have the same vulnerability, then in a sense, you're only halfway. And if you don't accept that vulnerability as part of existing in a community, then you are essentially an exoskeletal being going around always armoring yourself to protect yourself from the other, because their gaze, they don't mean good. They don't mean well. And so then I began to, yeah, that's true. You know, like that's what nation states are, you know, build a damn wall. We got to arm ourselves. We got to shield ourselves, you know. You go to rich neighborhoods, they're all gated communities. They they understand their vulnerability, but they don't care about the other's vulnerability. So we're gating each other. If you have open community, you have a neighborhood, you have a true community where everybody accept the fact that we're all vulnerable and we relate to each other in that way. And that's why you don't go and burn down the other guy's house, because they understand that they're not going to burn down your house as well, right? So that's a different kind of understanding, just seeing them as a mirror image, the mini you that you're relating to. And I thought that was a very interesting insight that he provided that allowed me to develop this notion of the vulnerable being and the exoskeletal being. We're crawling around like crabs, glaring at each other, being afraid. I mean, like, yeah, no, I don't know how we could do it. It's certainly on a nation state thing. We really have this thing, we got to stop these damn immigrants, like nothing but hooligans, terrorists, or whatever. I don't know. I mean, it's like I think the nubs of that is that you have to, in a sense, understand and look through their eyes to see if they're exoskeletal or whether they're more human.
Right.
I think that ability is important. It's difficult for me to understand because when I was very young, I grew up in China. And you don't stare at somebody square in the eye. That's rude, And I wonder whether that's been acculturated in China to, in a sense, to be somewhat slavish. I don't know. But so it's hard for me to like look you in the eye because that seemed like a rude thing to do. And so that's a habit. But you have to be able to look each other square in the eye and see this is a vulnerable and a friendly person. That's a person I gotta watch out for. That's it, Phil.
Thank you, Phil. Yeah, and I guess I need to also, reinforce that when we're talking about this idea of what do you do with people who are trapped at one of the stages of development, we're also talking about the idea that we all, even an Aristos, has to pass through those stages of development. There is nobody's born in Aristos. Nobody goes directly to it. We develop our noesis out of our experience of gnosis and our dissatisfactions with a life of pure naive gnosis. And the same is true for getting out of the Verstand oriented, overly noetic kind of mindset that results. We have only if we experience it enough to see how we can be hoist on our own petard through our ideas and logics do we come to understand their inadequacy and the need to move on to another stage of development. So, we're not just talking about, unlike the Greeks, ideally, this kind of late Greek perspective, asserts that these problems of differential capabilities and structuring a society to be able to handle people at each stage of development, in as healthy a way as possible, that's a problem that literally affects each and every one of us, right? I mean, the only people for whom it doesn't is people who never get beyond the Dualic stage, because then it doesn't really matter what's going on with the Banausic and Eristic stages, except to the extent to which you don't want to organize society so that Banausoi and Aristoi exploit the Douloi for their kind of literal mindedness and appetitiveness. So, these are major issues. And, I guess let me call on Sharon first before I go on. So come off mute, Sharon, and tell us what's on your mind.
So I have a different outlook. I think not everybody achieves arete. And as a community, as a society, we know the value or the worth of that society by how we treat our less advantaged. And just like in the jungle, in nature, where you have the lion, and then you have the ants, and everybody in between, Everybody has a role to play. And so not everybody, I don't think this is a utopia, not everybody will aim for the highest, either out of will or just total lack of will or just total lack of interest. And so what they do is they function at the level where they are, and we as a society accommodate them. That's my opinion. Gee, I forgot the second. Oh, the second thing I was going to say is, which follows on from that, is the development of arete does require, I think, a certain amount of challenge. So if you turn over the rock and you see the snake, you get moving. But it doesn't mean you don't turn over the rock if it's going to be a level of growth. Because engaging risk is growth. You grow from the valleys, hardly ever from the mountaintop. You grow from the valleys. And then the third thing, I think culture plays a significant role in the way you evolve. And I listened to Phil talking about eye contact in China, and eye contact in America is heavily encouraged, but in China, it probably is not. I didn't know that. But it's not a negative in China, but in America it is. And so I was reading Heidegger, and I came across this word called throwiness, in which means in one's environment, one becomes part of the culture, and all one's behavior consequently learned from that culture. And that I thought was pretty profound. So in a way, we're kind of automatons till we decide to exercise our desire to be arete. That's all I have to say. But I can't subscribe to the philosophy that you don't engage risk to be safe.
Right. Right. Yeah, otherwise there'd be no medical science.
Correct. There'd be no, not only medical science, there'd be no science at all.
Yeah.
The financial markets wouldn't function as the way they are. We wouldn't have different cars. The question is, how do you manage the risk and manage the risk to not only safety, but, money gets in the way and people get reckless. But there's this concept of risk management, the human safety and human well-being.
Right. Right.
But you always got to take a risk. You take one every day when you sit behind the wheel of a car.
Yes.
You never know.
And you take a risk if you don't get in a car and you stay at home, right?
Exactly.
I mean, there's risks all around.
But this question of what we call it, thrownness, I found that pretty fascinating from Heidegger.
Yeah.
And I thought it fit into what we're saying here. I forgot which sentence of Kenneth Smith that I read that says, in a way, we're kind of passive victims of our personality development unless we exercise personality. And the guys who have mental slavery, my favorite philosopher, Bob Marley says, free up your mind from mental slavery. None but ourselves can free our mind. And that's a development of the arete too. And I also wonder if the slaves that they're talking about in the Greek culture, are they mental slaves or are they actually physical slaves? I'm not sure about that.
Well, they've got two different terms.
Yes,
we don't. We're stuck with the same word for both things, and they have two different terms. So, yeah, it's important, because these are distinctions that matter. I mean, like Aristotle talks about what an injustice it is to put somebody into the wrong class when they're supposed to be in a different class. If somebody is inhabiting the slave class, but they've got gifts of arete in politics, and your society needs those gifts in order to survive, then your society is damaging itself by keeping that person a slave. when that's not their actual character or nature. And of course, it's obviously the same is conversely true. If you promote, to rule the government, somebody who has a slavish personality, then they not only enslave themselves with their own character, they enslave everybody else through their foolish decisions. It sets up the world for self-destruction. So this question of calibrating, kind of rights and responsibilities to the actual character of the individual, the concrete, real individual in front of you, that's the whole ball game, right? To what extent, from an ancient perspective, where they're trying to titrate these things, that's the whole ball game. If you get that right or if you get that wrong, and of course, in the end, ancient society collapsed because they couldn't figure it out. By the time you get into the Roman period, especially the imperial and late imperial period, whatever rationalization they had for their class societies had been shoved aside in favor of, short-term gain. And people were constantly manipulating the class system in order to try to get ahead. And numerous contemporary Roman commentators said this is going to be the death of us, that we're enslaving people who should be free, and we're being governed by people who should be slaves, and vice versa. So this is one of the defects of the ancient system. And by the time you get to the late ancient period, that's their assessment too. It's not working the way it was supposed to. I'm gonna just drop the opening of that sentence we were looking at in there again. Most are slaves to the dominant forces of their own psyche. And so, if you're going to learn to be self-provident, you're going to have to do it by studying and becoming an expert on the dominant forces of your own psyche. What are my strongest appetites? What are the ideologies that I'm prone to? How do I please myself by distorting reality? What are the ways I'm prone to do that? And if I don't know that, then I can't overcome it because I'm not aware that I'm even doing it.
None but ourselves can free our minds.
Right. So Bob Marley, right? This is a classic statement of the ancient worldview, right there.
Yes. It's not very profound, but I think it captures it.
It is profound. It is profound. Yeah, yeah. And then, but likewise, if you're gonna, so that's getting over yourself, but what about your society as a whole? If you're going to create a just politics, a just culture, a just society, it means that not only do you need to learn to be a student of the dominant forces of your own psyche, you need to learn to be a student of the dominant forces of other people's psyches as well, to figure out, are they being treated justly by society? Are they being given, capabilities, responsibilities commensurate with their character or not? If you can't read character, you can't match up, their duties and assignments and responsibilities accurately to them. And
no, I think that's a level of complexity that we're still struggling with today. And that is the character of the society. Yeah. How are we going to treat the less advantaged? Are we going to make fun of them? Or are we going to exhibit compassion and caring and kindness?
Right. But even the more advantaged, there is this idea that there's not a single ladder of arete, but there's many different aretes, right?
Correct. That was going to be my next point.
Oh, go ahead.
Excellence looks very different at an individual level.
That's right.
And excellence is married to opportunity and where you started your thing in life. And what's excellent for me is probably not excellent for you, not your level of excellence. But it doesn't mean it doesn't lead to a productive and healthy life.
Yeah.
Right. And the throwness that Heidegger talks about, I think we have different capacities to absorb different elements from the culture.
Yeah. I mean, if I walk into a hospital determined to put my hands on the anesthesia equipment because I think that I'd make a great anesthesiologist, I hope there's somebody to drag me away from it.
Yes.
Because I do not know what I'm doing. This is not my arete. And if I've got some unexamined part of my character that deludes me into thinking that I don't have to go to medical school and learn how to do it, I can just, pretend and I'm a smart guy, I'm sure I can figure it out, then I'm a hazard, right? People need to be protected from me. So, it's complex. Every different possible area of expertise, becomes a different area in which in which we need to be titrating these things. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Well, Kenneth says here, we're talking about slaves, not necessarily physically enslaved people, but self-enslaved. And he says, their extrovertive materialism binds them to a low estate. That can happen. I mean, in modernity, as opposed to Greek society, where there was still some aristic class, they would have said these people are idiotic or they're banausic, and they would have kept them away from the positions of influence, perhaps, may have actually bound them to a low estate. But that is not the case in modernity. We have right now, I think, pretty much united. Who is an idiotes? Oh, we've got one running for president. A man with billions of dollars, totally focused on me, me, me. He is a Greek idiot. People who are economic animals. Well, they would have been in the agora, doing pots and things in Athens, but they might well be Soviet oligarchs in today's world. They're not. When you remove the constraints and it's just the market, idiots can make it in the market. Sure, they can end up being wage slaves, addicted debt slaves, whatever. But their single-minded focus on themselves could lead to, I don't know, Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know. It doesn't mean that they fail economically in modernity. People that perhaps from the Greeks would say, that guy ought to be a slave. He ought not to have all that money because he doesn't know what to do with it. I'm being a little extreme, but this layering, I would say that one of the things is this sort of layering, like the psychology of that the reason governs the passions, governs the appetites in the human body. There's some order for the Greeks. We don't have the constraints of that order, so we can have people of all personality types. In some cases, their particular character defects may make them wildly successful, in modern society. So yes, I would say we definitely have the equivalent of ancient physically enslaved people that are kept down by addictive behaviors or low wages or debt. Somehow they've mismanaged or been forced into untenable situations that make for almost a physical thing, except they're not actually owned by anyone. But there are plenty of, I think, slavish personalities that have plenty of money, idiotic personalities that got plenty of money, and that we wouldn't think of as being enslaved. But I think when we read this, we need to say they're slaves everywhere at all class levels. It's not just, as Sharon says, how we treat the least among us. That's I think is actually an easier question than what do I do with a defective personality with $100 billion. How do I constrain him? You know, what do I do about Vladimir Putin? He's you know, we used to always in class be like the Rockefellers, you know, they only wanted what was theirs and what was next to theirs. Well, Vladimir Putin only wants what's his and what's next to his. And the fact that Europe is next to his means little or nothing to him. Should be. So maybe I'm being unclear here, but I think the text does support that as a critique of modernity. That I don't know. Well, enough. An idiot. Well, and the other thing is when we're talking about that, the idiots. We've talked. I mean, Phil and I know have talked a lot about the first part of the Republic, where you see all the stuff that the guardians have to go through. They get no wives, they get no possessions, they don't know who their children are. That's a deidification. You know, I mean, they're having to have any tendencies they have to be idiots removed from them to give them a chance to develop their heuristic capabilities. But you know, that doesn't apply in modernity necessarily.
No.
But enough.
Can I just say something here, because I think something Donald said. We talked about this before. The way the society views arete. $100 million? Does that make you arete in the society? Or kind, compassion, like is Mother Teresa arete? Or is Donald Trump with his money arete? And that, I think, is a question and an answer from the culture. And I don't, Rick, you can comment on that, but that's a question.
Yeah, so I mean, the Greeks, especially Aristotle, is very skeptical about equating arete with kind of external signifiers of social rank, whether it's money or respect or what have you. You know, he directly questions whether office hold, you know, well, he basically denies that someone has arete just because they hold an office. He says it's the purpose of a culture that has self-providence. It's supposed to ensure that people only hold office if they have the arete necessary to do it. But that what he observes instead among the Greeks is too often they're appointing any old person to office and then afterwards saying, since he holds office, ergo he has the arete that goes with it, which is, Aristotle says, is absolutely manifestly not true. These are orthogonal questions. It's like the question of, you know, wealth and one's direct contribution to the universe. And Aristotle would say they are orthogonal to each other. It could be that you have a lot of money because you contributed a lot to the universe, or it could be that you didn't contribute much to the universe, but you still have a lot of money. And the same is true if you don't have much money. It could be that you don't have much money because you have a slavish personality and you can't stop spending what you get. Or it could be that you don't have much money because you were unlucky. You know, and maybe you ought to be running the world, but you're never going to get the chance to do so. Now, these things are orthogonal. And so they have to be separated. The concerns have to be separated from each other. It's like that kind of separation is what Martin Luther King Jr. Talks about in his I Have a Dream speech, when he says, I dream of a world in which, you know, my children someday will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. He's saying the color of the skin and the content of the character are orthogonal to each other. It's not that nowhere has any black person ever stolen or done something, unkind or cruel. He's not saying that. He's saying you have to evaluate each person case by case and see who they are. What is their makeup? And that's what should be determining how people are treated. And that's essentially, when he says that, he's essentially saying the Aristotelian position. So yeah, these are serious concerns. And the ancient critique of the modern world would be that we have structured our economy in such a way, to use Donald's phrase, that we're all idiots. Because to be an idiot in the Greek perspective has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with whether you're concerned with your own things. And to a modern, we assume everybody's concerned with their own things. How could you not be concerned with your own things? And everybody in all of history must always have been concerned with their own things. But the Greeks didn't agree. They said, no, it's possible to make a society in which you can teach people to have larger concerns than their own things. It's just that modernity suppresses that. We don't have any Aristoi. Everybody's basically trapped in a conflict of interest in which we're all desperate to make next month's rent. And if we're not obsessively focused on generating the income necessary to pay our bills, we lose our home. We become homeless, which is a novel condition in history, that the majority of people have no home. They're basically renting a home. Even if they own it, they still have to pay taxes. They still have to deal with the government's ability to take it away if they deem that it's appropriate and so forth. So we're the first homeless people who, as a world civilization in history, who basically just rent food and, having enough to eat. And we rent having a place to stay, and we rent medical care right up until the instant we can't pay, and then we don't get it anymore. It's an interesting condition. And the consequence of doing that, we believe, the modern belief is that by turning everything into a marketplace and motivating people with existential threats, you get productivity out of them. But this is the mindset of the slave owner with a whip. If I whip people, if I threaten them, if I scare them, then I get productivity. And they can't explain how anybody else in the history of the world ever produced anything. There's a direct relationship between that mindset that we have to always threaten people, and the same people who say, all over the world, people of color could not possibly have built Machu Picchu or the Great Wall of China or the pyramids, because, who was there to threaten them? Without somebody there to threaten them, it would have been impossible. So must have been aliens, right? That's the only possible explanation. When your mindset about human motivation is so narrow that you can't imagine cultures that lived in a fundamentally different way than we do, you end up with these kind of absurdities as the logical conclusions, but the consequence from a Greek perspective is they would look at all of us and see how afraid we are at all times. How many Americans are 2 or 3 paychecks away from losing their home? Well, that's over half of them. So, we are obsessed with our own things because we're afraid at a fundamental level. And the Greeks would say that makes us all idiots. We're fundamentally unfit to govern. We don't have a politics. We don't have a culture. We just have a giant con game that's going on. The ancients would just shake their heads looking at us. It's like, this is a mess. And I don't know why any of you put up with it. This would be their take. Fei Wuling, you were at the head of the line, and then you dropped off. So I'm going to call on you next. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Thank you. Sorry. So I wasn't fully listening until I heard Phil talking about Chinese. So I wanted to comment on why Chinese people don't like to have direct eye contact. Perhaps you have already explained, then please excuse my
Go ahead.
lack of attention. So my rationale is that because the Chinese Communist Party used lies and deceits to get into power and to maintain their control and subdue over Chinese people, they got all Chinese people to lie and not to tell the truth, because they use fear and intimidation to govern. I think as a result, because everybody, like the party, like the people on the top, has something to hide. So they are afraid to have direct eye contacts often. That was my understanding. I'd like to hear Phil's comment or response. Thank you.
Thank you, Fei Ling. I can, before I call on Phil, I can add that this does vary a lot culturally. In New York City, I spent a month living in New York City when my parents were out there, well, back around 1980 or so, and I was shocked by the difference in people's mannerisms between Seattle and New York. In Seattle, people don't often look each other in the eyes, but they do sometimes. But in New York, it was a lot less common. I'd start looking around at people, and I noticed people got uncomfortable. And I later read, anthropological accounts that say it's partially related to population density. Like if you're in a rural area and there aren't many people around, you almost always look each other in the eyes because you want to see, hey, there's a person, who is that? But if you're on a subway and you've got hundreds of people around you, you can't like strike up a personal conversation with all 200 people in your immediate vicinity. You don't have the time, you don't have the attention span, and so forth. And so people sort of withdraw into themselves more. And I thought that by this comparison with New York, that I must be among, in the far end of people who just look each other in the eyes, because Seattle does it sort of more than New York does. Right up until I went to Amsterdam. And in Amsterdam, strangers walking down the street, you're sitting at a cafe trying to eat your sandwich, and people look you straight in the eyes as they walk by, and you're like, huh? What? Is that, do I know you? Am I forgetting something? And they just, nope, it's just Dutch. They just look you right in the eye as they walk by, and they're all doing it. So you find yourself stimulated going, am I being rude? Am I supposed to, participate in a conversation? It's just a different adaptation, because Amsterdam is more people than Seattle. So it was unexpected. But Phil, come off mute and tell us, what do you think about what Fei Ling had to say?
Yeah, I'll respond to that before I get to my point. Yes, I agree with you, Fei Ling. But I think that's a carryover that the Chinese Communist Party took. It's transforming that structure into one of authority and of hiding. And I think China has had a long history of hierarchical structures, which means the filial piety, So this looking down and not looking directly at somebody it was originally a sign of respect, like, father, whatever, and so forth. And that grew up into the fact that, the father of the father is the emperor. And so therefore there was a hierarchical structure, and that was in a sense a show of respect, but that show of respect also allows for the development of being hiding. And part of what you want to do is if you did something wrong, you don't want to show it. And so you respectfully hide it in some sense. So in some way, I think they took advantage of that, but I think it really is embedded in a kind of hierarchical structure. There's different levels of authority. Like I remember I was a second son. I have to respect my older brother. So there's a level of structure, whereas that in America and maybe in Western cultures in general, there's a respect for at least some form of equality. Like you and I are neighbors. My respect is not to bow down to you or you bow down to me. Is that we are directly related on some level. Even if you're a richer guy or you're a poor person, there's a relationship that on some level we are equal. Maybe in other aspects we're not, and therefore, in a sense, we look at each other, and that's not a disrespect. That's actually a kind of respect in a funny way. So I think in some sense one exists in that culture, because when I left China, it was still communist. I was very young, but I think it was structured more in the hierarchical structure. You got to show respect to your parents. It's not that you never look at your parents in the eye. It's just that, at least in many occasions, that's a show that you are in some ways inferior. I mean, I don't mean inferior in the sense that we might mean in the Western culture, but it's like you respect, your teacher, you respect all sorts of people that's above you. And it's a top-down structure, I remember when I was surprised in America, like when you misbehave or did something, and like some parents would go and argue with the teacher, like, but we got punished not only by the school, but we got punished by our parents. So there was a structure in which, like, so you misbehave, you're going to be doubly punished. It's not like your parents just feel sorry for you. Oh, no, it's like, the teacher, no, you're wrong because the teacher is always right. So that structure you have to accept. And that's part, well, I won't go beyond that. I think so it goes beyond the Communist Party. It's something they inherited and they took advantage of. So that's my belief. So
The roots go
Okay,
back.
I see. So it's thus in authority don't want to feel challenged by
Yeah.
being looked at directly in the eye.
that's right.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Actually, it was Confucianism that paved the way to communism.
That's right. That's absolutely right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Well, I wouldn't be too harsh on Confucianism, but I agree with the part of the authoritative structure. Yes.
Or at least the interpretation of Confucianism,
Yeah.
different sects of interpretations. Yeah.
Okay, I'll get to my point. I want to say, first of all, I addressed Sharon, that I totally love and respect Heidegger, except the fact that he's a Nazi. So that's a problem. But I think you could understand his Nazism, although he never really wanted to kill anybody. Uh, is that he was trapped into his thrownness in a way, right? He was
Mhm.
thrown into Germany. He was thrown into that culture. He was thrown into especially the concept of blood and soil. In other words, blood of Germany and the soil that you live in. So he was in some ways very much of a parochial. I mean, he needed to expand that because his philosophy really is more expansive than being thrown into blood and soil. So that's part of the problem. And if you could separate that, you could then understand his philosophy a little bit better than in a sense always peg him to his and I disrespect, by the way, his Nazi sympathies and participation actually. But the way you could see thrownness, that's a very important concept to Heidegger, is that you could interpret it two ways. One is you could interpret it religiously. In other words, thrownness sounds very much like fallenness. Thrown out of the Garden of Eden. God says, you think you're so smart, go make it on your own. And therefore, our duty, according to scripture, is that in your struggle through being thrown, using your intellect or whatever, your free will, hopefully you'll find your way back to Eden. Okay, so that's the circular relationship. But the other way, if you took a more atheistic point of view, you're thrown into the position you're in, let's say Heidegger in Germany. And you use your skills not so much to advance back to Eden, return to Eden, but to move ahead as much as you can through your thrownness, through the hermeneutic circle, interpreting your culture. And as you circle around and reinterpret your culture and the state you're in, you become much more familiar with the ground that you're thrown in. So you are, well, in some ways, pulled into that culture. You could also call it a fallen state into your culture. The problem is that he was in that way, he was still fallen because the thrownness of interpreting your culture, you also have to be able to interpret out of your culture. Not that he didn't, because he was certainly very friendly with the Japanese culture, but he wasn't friendly with some other cultures. His thing about Jews, some of his best students were Jews and his best friends were Jews because they were thrown into Germany. In fact, some of the Jews were more German than the Germans themselves, right? But nonetheless, his thing about blood and soil is that they are foreign culture that was thrown into Germany, and they were inauthentic Jewish people that became German, so that they were not German. So there's a problem there. I mean, that's a racism of his sort, right? So in spite of the fact that his best students, they loved him, and and he in a way loved them too, but he could never get over that. So so that throwness is very important. So you could take it either, you know, work your way back to Eden, or you could say, go forth and find a fork in the road and see what you could do with it. It's kind of more atheistic relationship, but you still have to start from the culture and interpret your way out of it. Okay, that's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. I'm going to call on Sharon, and then I'm going to take us back to the text, except I strongly suspect Sharon's about to take us back to the text, but come off mute and let's see
well, not yet. I'm about to ask another question because the thrownness that Heidegger talks about, and I'm reading the graphic, which is the beginner book. Rick, I won't forget that. You know, he talks about the concept of Dasein, Dasein, and Dasein is a generic concept, and it gets its validation from society. And that's how this little comic explains his association with Nazism, right? Because he says that the Daseins, he didn't see them as German. He saw them as different. And so society did not validate them, which again is the authenticity of a group of people based on how society sees them.
Yeah, he makes a difference between Dasein. It's pronounced Dasein. Dasein is not necessarily individual, by the way. So this is sort of related to Hegel. If you see Dasein as an individual, that Dasein is Geist.
Yeah.
But if you see Dasein as bigger, it's Zeitgeist. In other words, there's a cultural element of it. The Geist is always submerged to a certain degree into Zeitgeist. But Dasein as an individual could make a difference. Being authentic is the way you escape it, because through your interpretation, you should be able to see what is not working. Because he makes a distinction between real speech or real talk or real thinking versus what called idle chatter. Idle chatter is when you participate, in a sense, the culture, and you're doing your thing, and gossip, whatever, that's happening in culture. So he's always calling for you to be authentic to your way of being, to your way of circling in the circle of interpretation, which is important, because only in the circling will you be able to see the difference in the culture and your experience that authenticates where you're going to move out in some sense. So see it as kind of a whirlpool, and you just sort of somehow throw yourself out of that circle as well. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. Go ahead, Stephen. Come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm going to make this point. This sort of modern welfare attitude that you've got, that, oh, how you treat the poorest amongst you. And this idea, for example, oh, this is the first time in history you can lose your home. No.
No, it's the first time in history nobody has a home.
Oh, okay.
No, you could always lose your home. There were always things that could happen, but it was never normal that nobody has a home.
Okay, yeah, I've looked at it, these ancient cultures. As I said, I was interested in wargaming. I wanted to see the economic factors in a lot of these ancient cultures. And all right, you can take something like the Vikings. And the great thing about the Vikings is we have common people talking about themselves, not just the nobility and their singers of fame. We have, middle-class people who own small farms, and they're telling us what it's like. And one of these small farms, you probably had about 30 people on it. There's one guy that was master of the house. There was his wife. She was the mistress of the house. You had maybe some close family who were essentially workmen. And you had other people who were servants who were up the rank if they were highly skilled. They had a strong position in the household. And you go by the living circumstances, about half the people had a good position in the household. They were sleeping on benches. They were next to the fire pit. But you had about 15 people who were sleeping in the corner, and they were the lesser servants. This was a society where you had to pull your weight or you're gone. The mistress of the house controlled how much food you got. If you're a good worker, they fed you well. If you didn't have much to offer, you're on a starvation diet. You're on the way out. You could go and search for another master. They had that right. They did have chattel slavery, but it was temporary. Theoretically, you got your freedom in a few years. Your freedom to be at the bottom of society. You could go on, you could leave the farm. Oh, I don't like the way you're treating me. I think I'm better than that. I'll go to the master up the road and say, yeah, will you take me on? That was their freedom. But this enormous idea that you've got of welfare, presently the United States, and this is actually much of the Western world, is paying its welfare budget out of money it borrows from the rest of the world. And because the United States controls the world's banking system, it's very easy for the banker to go in and borrow the bank's money. And I can tell you that the people in Asia who are now materially very progressive are hopping mad about this, and you have a conflict brewing. And if the US dollar gets really on the nose and the United States cannot effectively borrow the surplus of other nations to feed its own welfare populace, you'll know all about it when it happens. And I'm afraid there's not enough people who understand this. Because you're in for a shock if things go south in a big way, a very big shock. And you'll end up with the United States, where a lot of people have been taken care of now will be expected to pull their weight. And actually, I have to say, you might be better off with a tougher society, which still has respect for people down the line, than a society that goes into shock all of a sudden and so suddenly finds that it can't pull its weight, because it could get very nasty, compared to a society which is tough, but still has some social rules. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, the thing that I'm talking about is not the idea that nobody ever lost their home. That's obviously not true. I'm talking about the idea that in the modern world, nobody has a home. And people think they have homes right up until they need medical care. You get end of life, like in the United States, the medical industry has grown to be such an enormous percentage of the gross national product. Generally speaking, end of life is so expensive, most families sell their homes. A large number of lower and middle class people can't inherit their home from their parents because they have to sell the parents' home to raise the money to pay for the medical care so that their parents can die in a comfortable way instead of dying in an uncomfortable way. And this kind of exploitative nature of healthcare in the US has created a condition in which it's turning into a minority of cases in which children who grow up in a home can be expected to have it. They're not going to. It's going to be sold off, rendered down for cash, sold back to the banks to raise enough money to be for their parents to pay for their medical care. This is also clear, in situations such as what is that phrase when the government decides they want to put a highway through, and so they have to get rid of your home. It's gotta be butt up. There's a legal term for that.
Eminent
Eminent
domain.
domain.
Eminent domain, yes. So, you really don't own your home. You're allowed to be there until somebody with more power decides they have a better use for it. So my specialty, my wife's specialty is medieval history. She's a historian. She got a degree in college, and we have bookcases full of stuff about Anglo-Saxon England and how it was structured. And yeah, I mean, at any given point, there might be some war and some warlord would come through and everybody loses their homes. But those events only happen now and then. The rest of the time, villages would last for 1,000 years. The Domesday Book would have, a register of some village with 40 people in it. And then, the Ordnance Survey of Great Britain would look at it in the 19th century, and that tiny little village is still there, and maybe it has about 40 people in it. That's, a huge stretch of time in which they're allowed to possess the land, to work the land, to farm. They had to work hard, right? There was no free ride, but it was their home, and they were allowed to be there. When you study the structure of medieval law and how manorialism worked, when a lord inherited a domain, he also inherited the serfs. They weren't his to dispose of. There were a lot of legal restrictions against messing with the serfs. There were strong limits, and the reason there were strong limits is the nobility understood that if they screwed up the village society that they were on top of, then they themselves wouldn't get fed. They needed the villages to be working effectively. And so for about 1,000 years throughout the medieval period, they mostly didn't mess with the villages very much, other than levying some taxes, needing a certain amount of work done on their own manors each year and things like that. But otherwise, they left them alone. And they needed that, because without that, there couldn't be an upper class.
Okay, feudalism wasn't as broad as people imagine.
No, but in Anglo-Saxon England, which is
okay. Prior to the Normans coming in, they did try to introduce feudalism. Anglo-Saxon England wasn't feudal. And the great thing about Anglo-Saxon England is they extracted a great deal of taxation out of people. And it came down to this, that you had to produce a surplus to pay the taxes. And if you didn't make that, you lost your home. Your lands were sold off to pay your taxes. Off you go. You're the rest of your life, you're a servant again. Maybe you'll strike lucky. It's not quite as simple as that. I appreciate the fact that your wife studies this history, because I'm not really a historian, but this period is not very well understood.
Right.
Like, there's crazy stuff. You can tell this to your wife. In Vikings, Franks, we have the Franks, we have the Vikings, we have the Franks, we have the Anglo-Saxons. And that shows making out that these people are so completely different. Because if you read the actual history, the Franks, the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings, their social values were so extraordinarily similar, except for the fact that the Vikings were still pagans. That was the huge line between both.
Right.
But thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. George, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, no, I mean, just the idiocy of the anti-enlightenment, the Nietzschean view of history. First and foremost, in the Roman period, I mean, that was the basis of the revolution in terms of emperorship, where the state took direct responsibility for the people of the polis, and the notion of bread and circuses and the notion of welfare in Rome in particular. And Rome was the center of the empire. Indeed, it is when Rome broke up as a city that essentially, well, the Western Empire fell apart after that. And so, indeed, you pointed to this, Rick, and that historically, I mean, this sort of neoliberal view of feudalism, forgive me for saying this, is so incredibly stupid. In fact of the matter, in ancient society, the elites were responsible for the public, right? They had a basis of legitimacy. And there were things like gleaning rights, right? And these kind of practices. And we have this view, this liberal conception of feudalism, which is completely false, which is, oh, the elites. Now, they did exploit the public, and there were lots of abuses, and they were above the law. But it's also valid, and you're alluding to this, Rick, is that the elites had a responsibility, right, in practice towards the public, right? And so, feudal society was very patriarchal in that sense, right? The king, the lord as the father, and the peasantry as, the children. Now, again, we're going to view that as demeaning, but in practice, it meant something, right? So the idea that, this false, and forgive me for saying this, completely stupid, moronic idea that, in ancient society, it was just sort of these individuals, sort of the market, right, in just the ancient world. And indeed, in fact of the matter, very little of the ancient feudal economy was actually based on market relations, right? I mean, there was the Silk Road, of course, right? I'm not diminishing the role of trade, but very little of the economy, the vast majority of it, was highly regulated, right? With a sense of, yes, the polity has you defer to the Lord because the Lord actually takes care of you, right? And that had to have some meaning, right? So, again, Stephen, I think because Stephen just pushing this anti-enlightenment false. Nahels does this. There's these lies about the past. He just makes things up, and he just reads falseness into the past to justify, forgive me, his own toxicity. So I'm carrying forward, other conversations into this. But again, it's just such a ignorant understanding of the past that I had to speak up about it. Forgive me. Thank you very much, Rick.
Thank you, George. Although we generally prefer to avoid ad hominems in this discussion, and
No, as do I. But the thing is that the problem becomes is the systemic disinformation, right? The overt effort to lie, to acknowledge ignorance, but still opine. And it's not simply that you're spewing ignorance, because I'm not always right. I make mistakes like anybody else. But the consistent effort to push a toxic line, diminishing humanity, consciously diminishing humanity. Again, forgive me. I feel the compulsion to call it out.
Okay.
Again, forgive me.
Thank you for that, George. I think I'm going to go ahead and call on Sharon and Phil, but I'm really going to drive us back to the text because we're trying to work our way through this book. So Sharon, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a quick comment on cultures, because that's what we're talking about it. And you talked about people losing their houses as they manage end-of-life care. Well, end-of-life care is a significant cultural issue. And I grew up in two cultures. And I'll just say this very differently. In the culture in which I grew up, multiple systemic disorders, obviously very...
Oh, you accidentally hit mute.
Very little way of recovering with any quality of life. Death became the friend. But that is not, in this culture, death is not the friend, because that's not the way. And that was one of the surprising things I learned. Death is the enemy. Do everything that you can. And that's where probably it's based on economics. I don't know. But I'm going to say that it's cultural, because that's where I first started seeing it.
That's interesting. So you're saying where you grew up in the Caribbean, they didn't have that kind of relationship to end of life.
No, no. When it was time to go, it was accepted. Very religious. You know, you're done your time. And of course, if you're young, then they make more effort. But if you're 70, 80, 90, if you're 70, we're not putting you on dialysis.
Interesting.
That's it. In fact, I tell a quick story. My dad got to 72 and he developed renal failure. And the medical system said no. So you want to be on dialysis, your daughters will have to pay for it. And that's what we did. Because it was not an option.
Yeah.
He had lived a full life. He had grown children. He had a productive wife. Not that it was time to go, but the resources could be used to help younger people who were at a severe disadvantage. And that's just the way it was. But the culture accepts that.
Right.
The culture accepted that.
That's interesting. Thank you, Sharon. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I want to address the issue of no longer ownership of your home. But almost everybody become renters, you know, except for the people that have owned the home for a long time and they just live through it because nobody can afford to buy a home now. It's too expensive. It's just way out of proportion. You know, that I think all of that has to do with debt-driven culture, you know. You have many things that I was going to transition into. This guy, he used to be the Greek financier who seems to be very interesting. Yanis Varoufakis. He talks about this. He call it feudal capitalism. I'm not sure if I agree with that totally, but nonetheless, it's good. And it has to do with the fact that our culture has adapted to a point where essentially you're paying for subscriptions, paying rent, and people like it that way, actually, you know. And instead of owning a record, you buy a subscription to a channel that will provide you with this music, or you pay, you know, subscription to cable, and I mean, all that stuff is pay in time. In other words, you pay it, and you never own anything. You know, in some ways, you're not encumbered by it, by the ownership of that. He says, in some ways, that culture had allowed for the development of, let's say, renting. For instance, for you developing an app, you have to actually pay Apple to use their platform. So what you do is you develop platform. And so even the capitalist who's working to make money and they hire people to do whatever it is they do, they now have to rent a platform in order to remain a capitalist. So part of the profits, which in a sense, they either pocket or they put it into development, or maybe if they were very generous, they would distribute it partly to the workers, you know. Now they have to take part of that and rent it to Apple. Or what's worse is like Amazon. Amazon now has become the total platform marketplace. Very few places could compete with it. Maybe Walmart could still compete with it, Target or something. But you buy everything. Everybody's renting a space because if you're not in this sort of distributed network, then in a sense, you know, you have a shopping center, you're in a shopping center, nobody goes to it anymore. Oh, it's just like too difficult. And we like it that way. And so therefore, part of what you pay for is that the business that actually sell you the thing that they make, that the workers make, that the business make, that they now go to a platform, they have to pay rent. So that's an interesting model that in a sense complicates the whole thing. And the whole thing could be taken advantage of because of that driven culture of that emerged from the fact that you pay for subscriptions, because essentially you're subscribing a rental space with Amazon to, in a sense, sell your goods. So everybody's doing the same thing. So that's a very advanced capitalism in a way, and it's like very complex. And of course, they give you, how they compensate you is for the convenience, like, oh God, I don't want to go spend an afternoon or day at the shopping center. I'll just go to Amazon and jolly quick, it's here next day. So there you go. I just be careful that we are now in the form of what he calls feudal capitalism, because the feudal lords are charging rent for you to be part of the system. That's it.
Thank you, Phil. All right, back to the text. So we're working our way through paragraph 10. And for those who joined late, why don't I drop both parts of paragraph 10 in here again, like so. That's the first half. And this is the second half. And we're in the last sentence of the first half now. And we're talking about this issue of Homo sapiens lacking self-providence. That we have this capacity, this gift that evolution has given us that allows us to be more creative and intelligent than other animals, but it comes at the price of being radically less self-provident than other animals. We're far more likely to act against what's healthy for us or for our species than other animals are. So, in talking about this issue that this is the ancient perspective, right? This is what we're looking at in this book. Is we're looking at what are the different epochs that have been well documented in Europe. What are the differences in their worldviews? How do they see the people and God and nature differently from each other? And we're trying to learn not to mock everybody who's different from us, but to learn to see through their eyes as well as through our own, to gain the ability to get perspective on our own society. What are the things we take for granted and we don't question that someone from ancient Greece would have immediately questioned the moment they saw us? Like, what the hell are you guys doing? Because if we can't do that, then we're like the fish that can't discover water, because that's what we're swimming in. So back to this sentence. So what we're talking about here, he says for these appetite-driven souls, but of course what he really means is either of these traps, either the appetite-driven trap, the experiential trap on the one hand, or the ideological, overly intellectual, rationalizing trap. That they're both a problem. They both lead to ways of acting in non-self-provident ways. And it's not just Aristotle. The Roman Juvenal remarks on this, that if you give somebody who's a prisoner of either their appetites or their ideologies a bunch of money or power, what they're going to do with it is entrap themselves further. It's like, how many people win the lottery and wreck their lives as a result? Because they overextend themselves, they give in to their addictions. They're now I can really buy all the cocaine I want. It's like the rush of the opportunity to get what you want. It sets people up for catastrophe on the Heraclitean concept that the things that we want are not necessarily the things that are self-provident for us. That word that we don't really have in English, that we are not drawn to what's healthy for us, and so it's a huge problem. So all right, let's start into the second half of this paragraph. We've now caught up with where we left off last week. It only took most of today to get through. So the new stuff, the stuff we haven't got through yet. So the first half of this next sentence: the Greeks deem anyone self-absorbed in his own private concerns and self-interest, and idiotes, that's idiota, which is one's own in Greek. And to a modern, everybody, our model of human beings is that everyone is concerned with their own things. How could they be concerned with anything else? We all look from our own perspective. We've got to pay our own bills. We care about our family, and we love the things that we love. We speak the language that we speak. How could anybody not be that? We almost have defined away the concept that somebody could look at the world from any perspective other than that. And idiotes for whom the larger worlds of nature and culture do not count. They don't respect the laws of nature to the extent that they can disregard them, and they don't respect the need to cultivate people who are not idiots, right? Because it's natural to them. They want their children to grow up just like they did. If they're an idiot, they want their kids to be an idiot, because they don't think that they're idiots, because they think it's a virtue to look through the blinders of being stuck inside a single perspective and never seriously questioning it, never seriously asking themselves, what's wrong with the perspective that I inherited? So he says here, the Greeks deem anyone self-absorbed in his own private concerns and self-interest to be the human type closest to the animal. And the second half of that sentence, which is the necessary corrective, is, but even the animal has its instinctively programmed course of maturation. And so what he's struggling with here is what we've been talking about. The Greeks thought in terms of hierarchies. So they're thinking in terms of people being above the animals because we can hunt the animals and we can domesticate the animals. But the more philosophical among them are recognizing that in some ways we're below the animals and that we lack the self-providence that comes naturally to them. Aristotle says, over half of the problems that people face are themselves or other people. Our biggest challenge in the world is not that the gods are against us or nature's against us. It's that we screw ourselves up. We get in our own way time after time. And that happens to us because we lack the instinct for self-providence that comes naturally. I was at the zoo day before yesterday, and the weaver birds are all, the boy weaver birds are all weaving their beautiful hanging nests and singing their little songs, trying to encourage the girl weaver birds to move in. And the girl weaver birds, they'll fly over and they'll take a good look at the nest, but if it is not up to snuff, they fly away again. And the boys are like, damn it, I gotta make a better nest. And they keep at it until they finally make a nest that's good enough. And the girl says, okay, I can move in and raise my brood here. So this relationship between the male and female weaver birds ensures that there's competition to make the best possible nest. They're really just going to do their best job. And the result is a higher survival rate for the eggs, right? They're more likely to raise the eggs, raise the chicks, and survive. But we compete on completely batshit stuff, right? They're competing on something that literally directly matters to their survival and the survival of their species. And we're competing on things, that wreck us and destroy us. And so what he's saying here with this juxtaposition of this opening part of the sentence and the closing part of the sentence is that the Greeks saw people as being above the animals, which that's an idea they inherited from their, Indo-European ancestors. But at the same time, they recognized that couldn't be the whole story. There's something broken about us. And in some ways, we're below the animals. And so their notion of these layers and hierarchies, like the layering of the four elements we talked about a month or two ago, and then the layering of the character types and the classes, there was a flaw in it. And the flaw in it is our place in the world is messier. And they couldn't figure out quite how to express it. In some of the Pacific Coast indigenous peoples, the way that they put it is that human beings are the younger brothers to the other animals. We're not actually better than they are. We're sure we're creative, sure we can do all kinds of things, but there's a lot that they know how to do that we don't know how to do, and we need to learn from them and pay attention to, among other things, the fact that they're self-provident, might clue us in that we should be focusing on that in ourselves. So this is a little struggle here around this issue. The Greek class society wants to treat human beings who get caught in either of the two traps, the overly experiential or the overly intellectual, as being closer to the animals. They aren't fully mature. They don't have a fully mature adult human mind. But in doing that, they're also kind of making the mistake of putting the animals under them when the animals are at the same time above them. And that the purpose of the mature adult mind that creates a palintropy so that it's able to pit gnosis and noesis against each other to try to get a more accurate picture of life and to discover where our self-providence lies. In doing that, we're actually trying to rise up to the level of the animals when it comes to their sort of miraculous instinctual capacity for self-providence that we almost utterly lack unless we cultivate it. George, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
What and there's a couple of things actually that come to mind as I'm listening to what you're saying and the reading. And it's interesting that in some ways the animal's superior to man because, and why really? Because we have imagination, right? The animal can't fantasize about where their next meal is going to come from or about avoiding predators, right? So they are in reality, right? One wants to say constantly. Whereas man, because of his imagination, he can construct fantasies that have really no bearing to reality. And in that way, he could end up starving, for instance, right? Or eating something that is dangerous to him because he's not following, right, that reality in front of him. He's thinking about some other garbage, right? And certainly, you know, we could see that in our politics. Now, which leads me to the second point, which is that for the Greeks, the idea of elevating humanity is the community, right? So it's the community, the laws, the rules that on the one hand, right, I mean, this allows for art. So in other words, channeling our imagination into something constructive, something that presumably leads to an authentic life, as opposed to just garbage. And also the rules prevent your fantasies from mucking up other people's lives. So, you know, and I'm going to introduce Plato very quickly because in another group I'm reading the laws. And it's interesting because what Plato makes the point is that the lawgiver, one goal of the lawgiver is to explain the law, right? Not just to make the rules, but to explain the justice in the rules. And so here, the community, the state is directly involved in elevating people, right? So it's not just, okay, do this, do that. It's, look, this is for the good of the community. You're part of the community. When the community thrives, you thrive, right? So yes, man can be his own worst enemy, and the community in the law, in norms, in morality, is not only meant to curb people's stupid fantasies, but it's also meant to elevate you, right? And hence the notion of community, art, you know, literature, but it's a dialectical process, right? It's a dialectical process. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Yeah, that there is this issue of, we were talking about a couple of weeks ago, of paideia, this issue of what are the things people need to learn in order to develop through cultivation and practice, the self-providence that comes instinctually to the animals. How do we take that atrophied faculty and develop it into something strong enough to keep us moving in a healthy direction? And, you know, to the Greeks, that was the central concern, anthropoculture. But of course, their relationship between the individual and the community is of course more complicated, because on the one hand, they recognize that if you want to cultivate a genuine individual who has a mature adult human mind, it takes a community to do that. But they didn't want that individual to then just blend and merge his identity into the community. They were also obsessed with competition and struggle. You know, they had the Olympic Games, they had the Nemean Games, and so forth. And they really wanted people to, like, in the same way that young cheetahs will race each other to, you know, try to develop their speed, they wanted people to, you know, to kind of rival each other and work side by side, and kind of, they wanted, Nietzsche talks about this, they actually actively wanted envy as a powerful force to spur people on to develop their arete farther than they would have if they'd been complacent. And so they're kind of, what they're doing is, you know, you can call it a dialectic. It's a polyntropy, that they're trying to have both the individual and the group in a tension with each other, so that it's able to be a motive force to drive the generation of a healthy culture.
Right, but this is, I mean, again, and I'm going to say to you, you know, to quote Nietzsche to me, I mean, I mean, of course you can do it for it. Don't get me wrong, but everything Nietzsche says is garbage. But I think my read of it is that and this is the whole question about humans and animals, right? Which is that we naturally incline to imagination. We naturally incline to fantasy, right? So yeah, I mean, there may be some conception of, and indeed, and it's interesting. I mean, you evoke the Greek games, and to me, it's very interesting. I had this whole, and I couldn't even understand it. I had this whole knockdown, drag out debate on Meetup not too long ago, saying, "Oh, humans are competitive," and like they kept coming back to sports, and I'm like, well, I mean, doesn't that prove they're not competitive? Because sports are considered games, right? They're considered nothing, right? They're irrelevant. That's why they're games. So competition really is, no one's denying that it's an actual part of our psyche, but competition in really, if you're going to look at the games, competition is deemed dangerous. That's why you have to sort of spew it in a direction that's harmless, right? Now, so I think in this notion, again, it's this relationship to animals, which is humans naturally fantasize. You know, there's no necessary need to impel people. Now, maybe there is some thought in Greek, there's some notion in Greek thought that says they do. But I'm simply saying that if we're going to take that animal analogy on its face, which is that humans naturally fantasize, they naturally get creative. The problem becomes is when that creativity and fantasy becomes narcissistic, solipsistic. And then it leads to death, the person's death, and you harm others, right? So society is not about really impelling people to fantasize, to be creative. It's about regulating those fantasies and that creativity in ways that A, is not harmful for the community, and B, ideally actually aids the community, right? So, you know, again, Nietzsche is always garbage. Nietzsche is always saying toxic things. Nietzsche lived his life alone because no one could stand him, right? And so again, if we're going to take that animal, I keep drawing on that because it is a fascinating thing when you think about this with regards, when you put that juxtaposition between people and animals. I mean, to say that animals are superior is a fascinating question. Because why? Because they don't get creative, right? They just do what they need to do. Humans are not don't do what they need to do. They get creative, they fantasize. And that stuff can become, of course, I'm going to finish on this point. I'm sorry if I'm going around. In some ways, yeah, we laud it, right? But we laud it only as part of the community. If the individual is just getting, you know, fantasies and toxicity and solipsism, then that's when they're worse than the animal, right? That's when they're worse than the animal. It's when they're channeling into community, then they're above the animal. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. Yeah, I think of course, the challenge for this chapter is not to say how the world is. The challenge for this chapter is to say, how did the ancients think that the world is? Just like the next section that we're going to do after, when we finish up chapter 4 and we move on to the medieval section, then our focus, again, isn't to say, what is the world like, but to say, what did the medievals think the world is like? And we're trying to learn to see the world through their eyes and not through our eyes, because we already can see through our eyes. So right. This issue about competition versus cooperation, this is a typical issue where a modern perspective is that, well, one of them must be bad and one of them must be good. The moderns really like the law of the excluded middle. There's one there in any choice, one is bad and one is good, like heaven versus hell or good versus evil. But the ancients didn't believe that way. This is a pre-Christian kind of culture. So they believed instead that what you needed was a dynamic system, like stringing the wood and the string together to create a bow, to create a dialectic. Just like we have, you know, insulin and glucagon both to regulate our blood sugar. If we only had one, we'd die. So this is why Aristotle talks about the golden mean and says, you know, the golden mean, we're establishing the virtue on the concept that an excess in either direction in a dialectic is bad. It's both bad to compete too much and be too, to devolve into conflict. But it's equally bad to be overly cooperative and everybody just wants to get along and nobody wants to strive. They thought both of those things were bad.
Well, I mean, and I want to say to you, and because I think there's, and I know you're not, I say this in the spirit of generosity and kindness. I know you're offering a critique of what I'm saying because you're suggesting that I'm going outside the text. And what I, you know, again, I don't believe I'm going outside the text. I mean, certainly, I mean, we could say, of course, that a lack of individual initiative and a lack of ambition, right? I don't think that that's distinct to the Greeks or anyone else. I mean, I think that's sort of very intuitive thought, right? I mean, my point is to simply say that when we look at these concepts in practice, right, that in fact, we really don't need to impel people to be too ambitious, broadly speaking, right? That indeed, the goal for the ancient Greek, is to channel that ambition into ways that are socially and even individually constructive. And that's the tension, right? That's the tension. I'm not going to say in any individual, sure, Rick, if you have no ambitions personally, I'm going to say that's a problem for Rick, but that's not a problem for humanity, right? If anything, people have too many ambitions. People have too many fantasies, right? So again, I think the Greeks are really trying to come to terms with that idea of how do you take that creativity, that ambition, right? And how is it that in practice, and how is it that you can reform society to make sure that that ambition and creativity is channeled in good ways? That's why I refer to Plato and the laws, because this is what Plato was talking about. He's saying, look, justice and the laws, in some way connecting it to this discussion, is about regulating ambition and making sure that society benefits from that ambition, as well as the individual benefits from their own ambition. I mean, again, my only point is I think I'm sort of unpacking the text, in my opinion, I'll say respectfully.
Thank you, George. Zelig, you want to come off mute and tell us what's on your mind?
Yes. In regards to the text, I think about how you have individuals, right? Idiotes focusing on themselves. It makes me think of Adam Smith's theory of the invisible hand, right? Where he understood that people's first concern is their immediate surroundings. It's their families, it's their immediate friends. And so they were going to think about how they're going to get goods and services for themselves, not in a general sense of how am I going to get goods and services for England or for Scotland, right? You only think about your own immediate people. And Adam Smith then said, well, we can't get rid of this idiotest in human nature. And what Adam Smith postulated was this idea that if you let individuals seek their own goods and services, then eventually the invisible hand that he postulated would benefit the collective, right? It would benefit England or Scotland. And so the more that you would allow these individuals to seek their private instincts and their private interests, the more it would benefit society. But I think that in that sense, it was fine in the Smithian capitalism of his days, because it took a lot of effort to build a chair back in the days of Smith. It took a lot of people, and so it benefited that I had an immediate desire to fill the chairs in my house, because that employed 50, 60, 70 people to build that chair in the Smithian capitalism of the day. But as technology advanced, in which our era we're living in, you can make a chair with one robot. And so now you don't employ 50, 60, 80 people to make a chair. Now you just employ a robot that works 24 hours without rest. And so I think one of the challenges that we're facing is that today we're like, well, wait a minute. The more we seek our interests, the more we create these robots, the less people are employed, the more people are out of a job, the more difficult it is to buy a home. And then as physics advances, and now you can actually monetize homes and monetize time and sell it, and the more difficult it is for individuals to kind of see the benefit of seeking your private interest for the benefit of the whole. And so I think that I think another big question that, Heidegger was mentioned, and I think he was spot on, it's technology. I think that the question of seeking our own self-interest, is that a negative thing? In the Smithian times, I don't think so, because it did make nations wealthy. But if you would ask the same question, should individuals seek their own good in our time? That's a different question, because now we use technology to basically get one need, right? A necessity as a human being fulfilled more immediately. Whereas in the Smithian times, it would take 30 to 60 people to fulfill that need that I had to be satisfied. And even if we go even one step back before, you know, coinage or minting was created and bartering existed, it took even more people involved in satisfying my needs. And so seeking my own self-interest was actually a positive thing. But I think we're entering times where technology that Heidegger saw, it's complicating things, because it's let me just finish with this. If you want to satisfy your needs today, you can just pop a fentanyl pill and you're satisfied. That's the level of technology that we are at. And some people decide that all of that benefit of me working for a living, having a family to get pleasure, I can get rid of all of that with a little bit of fentanyl, and I'll be happy for the rest of my life, and I never have to get out of this because of technology, right? Chemistry. And so I think technology, I think what Heidegger saw, technology is as whether self-interest is a good thing. And I think that the Greeks, in their own way, I think they were right, because if you would have that tension between self-interest and collective interest, the invisible hand, if you want to have it, benefited them for a minute. So that's kind of what I got from hearing the Greek perspective.
Thank you, Zelig. Yeah, I think it's probably important to see the distinction between self-interest and self-providence, because self-interest is a modern concept related to the market, and it's usually related to your balance sheet. If you have a big number, then you have a big self-interest, and if you have a small balance number, then you have a small self-interest. And so, you know, if you engage in a transaction that raises your balance number a whole lot, then you have a large interest in that situation. But this isn't at all what the Greeks were talking about, because what they're concerned about is self-providence, which is, do you have the capacity to recognize what's healthy for you? And have you cultivated yourself, and has your society cultivated you to develop taking a, you know, to care about doing what's healthy for you? And I think the example you gave of fentanyl is a perfect one for distinguishing between, you know, what I want versus what's provident for me. You know, if you know, I think about that interesting experiment where, you remember they put a mouse in a bear cage, and they gave it 2 water bottles, and one of them had, I think it was laced with cocaine, and the rats frantically lapped up the cocaine water, and everyone said, "Oh yeah, see, well, this just proves what people are like." And it's our nature biologically to be this way. But then somebody else came along and said, no, there's nothing about this cage that's normal to a rat environment. So instead they offered, instead of a cage, this whole rich environment full of rat toys and rat blankets and other rats to hang out with and have relationships with, and great food. And then they offered them the choice between the cocaine water or the regular water. And they hardly ever drink the cocaine water. So it turns out people are doing just exactly what you described, right? The rat is miserable, and so it doesn't see any way to make the misery go away except to drink the cocaine laced water. But that's what it turns to in desperation, in the absence of the choice. Given the choice, it wants the self-provident things. It wants the things that are healthy for it, and if it has the opportunity, it turns to them. And it does that not because people would do that, but because rats are self-provident in a way that human beings are not. We frequently, whether we turn to drugs or not, that's an experiment that needs to be run in the same way that it was run for rats, to see what we're like. But generally speaking, we have this problem that we aren't usually as successful as the animals are in recognizing where our providence lies.
Well, I would like to mention something, Rick. I think we look at San Francisco, right? I think a lot of the people that are living there, they have a difficult time getting out of once you're caught by fentanyl. It's extremely difficult to get out of the same level of pleasure that anything else in life will ever give. It's work will never again be the same. Having a family will ever be match those levels of pleasure. Yeah. And so I think that on that level, we as human beings, we get to that idea of redefining what health is, right? Because I majored in biology, and to me, health is your heart is working properly, your blood pressure is at its appropriate levels, your eye is working properly. We as human beings know biologically what health is, but then we also have the capacity to redefine it and say, well, health to me, as someone who's addicted to fentanyl, is a fix of fentanyl. That's healthy because it makes me feel good. Otherwise, I go into convulsions and I have a very bad time. And I think as human beings, we have that power to redefine what health is, whereas animals, they can't do that. They can't but try to seek to fulfill their biological needs, whereas we as human beings, we can redefine it in many different, our fantasy is the limit, right?
Thanks, Alec. I see Sharon would like to add something based on her medical experience.
Yes, because I'd like to say that this, Mr. Zelig, there is no comparison for a healthy state, which is self-providence, with a disease state. A disease state has no benefit. In fact, if you're aware of the statistics, most fentanyl users, the way out of it for them is death. In fact, most drug addictions. Death is the ultimate game. So self-providence doesn't belong in the same conversation with addiction.
Well, let me interact with you, Sharon. There, I think what's interesting is that it would be like with food, right? Food could become an addiction, where you start eating for nourishment, but then you start consuming food because now you no longer consider it for the benefit of your body, but now because you're just addicted to the food consuming to the point that you actually end up getting heart failures, heart congestion, and die of a heart attack. And so I think on that level, I think that fentanyl and drugs do become a disease, but also I'm pretty sure that I would say start as a choice, right? We're not born with a need to fentanyl, but the choices of like, I broke my leg and now I'm on fentanyl, and then eventually I misuse it, or they'd actually, like the oxycodone, basically the exposés that they've done on oxycodone, that the manufacturers actually lied, that the dosages were not as addictive as they were saying that it was, eventually ended up getting people hooked on oxycodone and basically caused what we have today, right? The opiate epidemic. And so I think it started as a choice, and it becomes a chronic disease that you can't get out of. And like you say, death is the only way. And yeah, I would agree to a degree.
But self-providence and addiction do not belong in the same sentence. Addiction, like food is, always has negative consequence. Self-providence is an enhancing human condition if you participate.
Yeah. I agree with that. Yeah,
I think we're in agreement about that. Yeah.
So that's it. It's like comparing apples and oranges. There's just absolutely no comparison. An addiction is a disease, it's a disorder. And not everybody gets addicted after exposure either. There's significant variability with that.
Right. But what it works as is a kind of an example of the ways in which our desires can become split off from what's self-provident for us. And it happens, it doesn't actually require fentanyl for a human being to lose their way and lose their self-providence. We're actually born with very weak grasp on our self-providence. And growing up, even if we didn't have, and this is the Greeks, right? This is the Greeks writing about this. They haven't developed modern industrial methods of advertising and PR and manipulating people's appetites. The market is in a primitive state, when they're writing these critiques. But they're saying even at a primitive state, it's already clear how easy it is for people to lose their way and pursue with great interest and avidity things that are absolutely not healthy for them. It's like this is a liability in the character of our species that our grasp is so weak.
The question of choice is also a very weak one. What is stronger is genetic predisposition. Some people will take fentanyl a couple of days, never do it again. One dose for some people and they're hooked. So yes, it's choice, but it's based heavy, like an alcoholic. Some people can take a drink. I mean, I can drink and then I'm fine. But then some people, once they take one drink, that's it.
Yeah.
Well, there's something in your genes that can override your will. And that's the fascination of who we are.
Yeah. That's right.
Don't show up in my house with the pizza, because I cannot say no to that.
Well, you know, Zellig, I understand. I can eat you a whole loaf of bread, but I don't. You
Well,
know?
I wouldn't make the argument that a pizza is never self-provident, right? I mean, you know, for a hungry person,
Tell that to my wife. Tell that to my wife.
Yeah. But I just want us to be very clear about the different mechanism. It's two
Yes.
different entities.
Yes.
One is health, healthy mind, and one is disease, disease mind. And
I
they
think-
function two different ways.
Well, I think what we've discovered, Sharon, with epigenetics is that our character, genes have something to do. Genes can express certain ways of, if you're a really nervous person, or whether you're a person who doesn't like to be around people, it could be epigenetics, and so that's an area that is just developing as well.
Yes. In fact, I will just share this, you know, talking about obesity, the Ozempic, that new drug, that's like the wonder for us now. We're beginning to wonder if Ozempic, because it stimulates the SGLT, crosses the blood-brain barrier, if it can treat addiction. We're seeing how people don't want to smoke, how it's impacting drug abusers. And a lot of this is pretty embryonic.
Now that you bring that up, Sharon, that's exactly what I was going to talk about in relationship to the text. Ozempic is an example of in especially in America, right, where the majority of Americans are probably going to die of a heart attack due to our diets, and
Not the majority. Sorry.
Well, the majority die of heart attacks. That from last time I checked, I might check my information again, but most of the issues are heart problems. And Ozempic, if you said to somebody, why aren't you not losing weight? They would say, well, it's because you got a character issue. You need to control yourself. And Ozempic is presenting that question of like, hey, maybe your body actually fights against you when you try to lose weight, and it influences in your food choices. It doesn't allow you to actually overcome obesity problems. So Ozempic is an interesting question of whether in modernity, what used to be character questions are now biological chemistry questions.
Yeah, we discovered the fat gene a couple of years ago, you know, so it's an exciting evolution, and that's all I'll say, particularly that drug. Yeah. I think in another 10 years, we'll have myriad of uses for it. And the fat shaming that used to go on, we're going to find it's probably completely genetic. But again, addiction and self-providence do not belong in the same sentence. That's the whole point I want to make.
Thank you both. I'm going to call on Phil. What's on your mind, Phil?
Well, I have to first of all say that I'm an artist, and it seems to me the issue here is really on a very fundamental level. It's really the relationship between figure and ground. And when you expand that, it really has to do with the singularity of that individual with the ground, which is the environment, but the context in which it is based upon. It seems to me there are three major divisions: the cosmic level, just planets, asteroids in relationship to the universe. And to my best understanding, at least at this point, is pretty much deterministic. In other words, depending on the configuration of the planets and how they are in relationship to the energy, it's going to be what it's going to be. But it does have an evolutionary process that, the sun takes so long for it to burn through its hydrogen, then turn it into helium and so forth. And that sun has to be so big before when it explodes, it creates something that's like iron or something that's much more molecular. And so in some sense, that's not any kind of free will, but it's just deterministic in terms of the the physical structure of the thing. Then there is something that's like what we call nature, which is life. Life, in some sense, has some relationship to the environment because, you know, a lion depends how many antelopes there are. The antelope depends on the lion, and all these configurations. It seems to me that's a relationship. So no matter how self-provident the gazelle is, it depends also, part of the factor is the environment, how it's all structured. So that structure, in some sense, has a determination on the singularity of the individual or even a small group of individuals. So in some sense, there's that balance. But in terms of human beings, it seems to be the evolution of the individual with civilization. And it really brings in to me like Hegel, you know, we are so damn smart. We think we know how to manage this relationship, but in fact, we don't. And history shows it. It goes through an evolutionary process to evolve to what we are. And that's one of the reasons is we're so ignorant that we don't even get it until, you know, until dusk. That's when Minerva takes flight, changes into something else. So in some sense, it seems to me that is manifested in the relationship between Geist and Zeitgeist, you know, the relationship between the larger culture and the individual. And in some sense, we have become so, how should I say, constrained, structured by Zeitgeist or culture, that Geist itself, not that it has no maneuvering room, but it's sort of constricted in some sense. I was interested in a geopolitical thinker, but who's also interested in economics. Peter Zion. He taught out two things that was very interesting to me. You know, he says, you know, when the culture, and most of it developed in the 20th century, because most nations were still agrarian until, you know, pretty much after the Second World War. And what happened was, after the Second World War, when there was international trade, he professed it was really because the Americans transformed that into a protection scheme, which allows the freedom of trading between any nation to any other nation. Or whether that part is true or not, I kind of think it is true. And I'll add that part. It was a buy-off in terms of, let's say, guaranteeing this freedom for trade and even penetrating into our markets for the security protection against the Soviet Union. In some sense, it was a containment strategy for the Americans, but it was a kind of a buy-off and allowing other economies to grow. What happened was that as a trade began to develop, what happened was that people began to move into cities. But whereas it took, let's say, 6 generations for the United States to develop from agrarian culture into urban culture, it took the Chinese and much of the third world to mushroom within 1 or 2 generations. And so what he said was interesting is that and he is analyzing, particularly in that relationship, what happened is when people live in the farms, they had many children. And that was much more a kind of a kind of economic structure, because children was in some sense free labor that you need to help in the farm to maintain it, because you need more bodies, otherwise you have to hire people who come in and do it. But when you move into the city, what you're doing is that you slowly are constricted into living in maybe 2-bedroom condominium, maybe 1-bedroom condominium. And so parents are, he calls it, smart enough to realize, hey, this is not working out. It's expensive, you know. children are just a nuisance rather than a surplus labor. And so what happened is that you have less children. So instead of having, let's say, 7 children, you might end up having only 1 or 2. And that's beyond the restriction that the Chinese put in. And so what happened was that it slowly emerged, and they didn't realize what happened. And what happened was at a certain time frame, it was to advantage because the surplus labor, let's say by the time you're 22 or whatever, and that population, which used to be a pyramid shape, begins to rise up, and you have a lot of labor, and then, but you have fewer children. And then when that grow up, move higher, let's say when you're like, 45 to 55, you develop into a kind of economy in which you have excess value. In other words, you have a lot of money, and that money provided, in a sense, a relationship to keep the economy going, because you need money in order to create a production. And so, but what happened is eventually that surplus mature into retirement. And what you do is you become draining to the economy because you begin to pull out the money from the thing. All of that is structured in relationship to how we're so dependent on the money as a regulating factor in terms of controlling the structure of the zeitgeist. You can see, and that is a very, very important factor. And what happened is that, as it happened in Japan and later on in Korea and Germany, what happened is that you run out of children. And when you run out of children, you're going to run out in 20, 30 years out of working age adults to provide the production, okay? And then you're going to run out of money because there's going to be very few people who are very skilled at what they do. And then finally, so what happened is that's going to drain the economy. So that whole cycle is, it's interesting that it was a determining factor in terms of developing the ecology of civilization, of the zeitgeist. That individual make that decision, but they were structured in a system in which they did not realize what was happening, but that's what's that's what eventually happened. The second thing he said that was very interesting is, now that we have seen the globalization begin to break down, we're going to lose labor. And then what happened is that it used to be, he said, back, let's say, when it all began, when you make like clothing, it used to be a bunch of women with sewing machines living in, let's say, Tennessee or Kentucky or North Carolina. They sew, okay? And when it expanded, what happened is that the production moved to Mexico because of cheaper labor, okay? And then when that change happened more, then it moved to Southeast Asia, okay? And what happened is, now that the globalization is breaking down, that's not going to happen. You're going to have no clothes. That's when technology come in. And he said there's a factory, and they only found this out because we were pressed into how we're going to have clothes now, is that they discover with technology the way it is, you only need a computer operator and maybe a mechanic, and you could take raw cotton, spin it in your yarn, and the yarn cure, and then the machines itself is able to weave it all together in this way. And in some sense, 2 men, and maybe he exaggerated in terms of this being 2 men could produce more product than a whole shitload of people working in Bangladesh. So that there you have technology intervening in culture, okay, in some sense. And they did not know this until they were forced into do it, because let's just go to Indonesia and do that. But now that's going to be negated because you don't have the transport system that's guaranteed. And so you have to do it at home. But now they found out that in fact, one machine, a very, very big industry, could cure all of this stuff and make it cheaper than going to Bangladesh to produce the clothing and cut it and do all that stuff, sew it all together. That's just both amazing and in some sense frightening. That's
on that cheery note, that's the end of our time for today. So thank you all for participating, and come back next week with your questions, comments, and concerns, and we'll continue with the text. Thanks, everyone.
We're still in F. I thought we moved the G. So
we're still in G.
Oh, I mean G.
We're in paragraph 10 of G.
Okay, G. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
A lot of the things he's talking about has already happened. And in medicine, we're making artificial limbs, artificial heart, valves by technology.